I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the news from the Donbas as Russian forces continue their slow but deadly advance. We also discuss the latest updates on the energy crisis and look forward to the weekend, when Russia looks likely to default on its foreign debts for the first time since 1918.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 23rd of June, day 120. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Nicholls, and economics reporter, Louis Ashworth. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. The latest is, as we've seen for the last few weeks, which there's been a lot of heavy shelling, still almost an uptick, I think, in the last few days. The Donbas is being absolutely destroyed. The eastern part there, what's left of Severodonetsk, is still getting absolutely mauled. But all the villages around there, Ukraine say that they've announced this morning that they've had to pull out of two hamlets to the southeast of Lysychansk. So Lysychansk is the town just west of Severodonetsk, separated by the river and on slightly higher ground, so easier to defend. However, that is a salient. That pocket there, the Severodonetsk Lysychansk salient, is surrounded by Russians to the east, north, northwest, and southwest as well. So very, very tight in there. A lot of heavy fighting going on, heavy artillery shelling. And as I say, Ukraine said this morning they've had to pull out of two hamlets just about 5 miles-ish to the southeast of Lysychansk, which will probably undoubtedly cede that little bit of ground to Russia. That doesn't close the pocket off completely, but it is getting extremely tight in there. Elsewhere, more shelling in Kharkiv to the north, civilians killed there, and in Mykolaiv to the south. So Ukraine is saying that possibly the action in the north around Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, is a bid by Russia to get Ukraine to divert troops that way to deal with the recent uptick in shelling there. I mean, they're not backing it up. Russia's not backing that up with any sustained ground assault to try and retake any of the ground there or make a concerted push against Kharkiv, as we saw in the first few weeks of the war. So it does seem like it's just what's called nuisance shelling, which sounds a very light phrase, but it's not a great nuisance when there's 152 mil shells coming at you. But yeah, the lack of any great ground backup suggests that it is a push there just to try and get Ukraine to divert resources north. In the south, on Wednesday we saw buildings hit by shells. A school was hit by shells, and that has continued today. Reports of civilian deaths there as well. So a lot of artillery going around the place. Ukraine also announced, Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister, announced in the last hour that the first of the US HIMARS system, the high mobility artillery rocket system, the very long range is great, accuracy is even better. So the very long range, very high precision artillery is now in Ukraine with trained crews. He didn't say numbers, you wouldn't expect him to either, but that's a good move for good news for Ukraine to have such long range and high precision artillery. And also worth noting that the Germany are supplying now the Panzer Howitzer 2000. The numbers there they are going in. We expect them in July. There's nothing to suggest that they are not going to be there for July. And equally, the Gepard anti-air, so twin 35mm cannons, very good at shooting down drones, helicopters. So good sort of close point air defence. So the Gepard are going in as well. Should be there for July. Elsewhere, just one more thing to note. In just a suburb to the northwest of Kherson, please forgive my pronunciation, but Chornobaivka. It's literally the blob on the northwest bit of Kherson, and Ukraine has been pushing in that direction recently, thought to be now about 15 k's ish short of Kherson. There's been an attack on the car of Yuri Tulyov, who's the leader of that, or the leader of that self-proclaimed area. He was a former director of a local bus depot. He's now the leader of Russia's appointed leader for that area. His car was blown up. He was injured, not killed. But it speaks of, as we've mentioned a few times on the pod, this this growing resistance to civilian-led or maybe military-led, but resistance from the civilian population from Ukraine, which has taken particular focus in the south. And I'll take a pause there.
Thank you very much. And Dom, before we come back to you to talk about EU candidacy status for Ukraine, Louis, can I turn to you, Louis Ashworth? Germany has entered phase 2 of its 3-stage emergency gas plan today. Can you tell us about this? Why have they done that?
Hi, David. Yes. So, Germany's moved into the second phase of a sort of 3-stage emergency gas plan. We'd sort of known that this was coming. So Robert Habeck, who's the country's economic minister, announced in a statement on Sunday that this was going to happen. This was expected, but that doesn't stop it being a kind of a big deal. So there's a few different elements to this plan. And one of the sort of main ones is that it involves reactivating Germany's coal plants. So that's obviously a big kind of controversial issue. You sort of have to feel a bit of sympathy for Robert Habeck, who is a Green politician and entered the German government coalition as a Green, and is being forced to be the face of the sort of reopening of coal plants. But that's the hand that history has dealt him. Other elements of this plan include requesting that Germans try and reduce their use of energy, and also Berlin's offering about 15 billion euros of credit lines to storage facilities. So basically, that's going to be loans at very favourable rates that will allow the facilities to try and build up capacity ahead of the winter. The reason this has had to happen, it was sort of expected this may occur at some point during the year anyway. What has occurred, though, is that Putin in recent weeks has really cut back on the amount of gas that's coming through the Nord Stream pipeline into Germany. At the moment, it's at about 40% of its normal capacity. That is a major blow, and it's clearly, Putin putting some kind of pressure on the sort of the energy windpipe to the West. It's a very conscious effort to squeeze the West, intensify this economic pain that's been occurring for the West as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. And so it's forced this action from the Germans. Significantly, step 3 in the German emergency plan would be to bring in rationing, in which case you would start to have a prioritization of usage of energy for households and essential businesses, and other businesses would be told to try and cut down on their usage. Obviously, that's a very extreme step, and there's fierce opposition in Germany, which, of course, is a very the business lobbies in Germany are extremely influential, as we well know. They will not be happy that this is on the horizon. But if Putin chooses to press ahead with reducing these flows, it may prove to be inevitable. So Robert Habeck has said he hopes gas rationing won't be needed, but said that he can't rule it out.
And just, has this affected any other European countries as well, or is it the Germans who are taking the sort of the full brunt of it?
Well, it's a pan-continental thing. So we've already, as we've discussed on previous podcasts, some countries have already been effectively cut off by Russia, and basically they have been countries that are already less reliant on Russian gas. So Russia's been kind of nibbling at the edges, and it's been less the case that in doing so it's been actually properly cutting countries off from energy and causing energy crises. It's been hitting countries that are more self-reliant anyway, or more reliant on other sources. So the real kind of economic core of Europe that has been super reliant on Russian gas, so Germany, Austria in particular, that remains kind of untouched until now, and it's only now that that Putin is beginning to sort of turn that screw. So obviously, any action that Germany takes is going to have influence across the whole continent. I mean, it's Europe's biggest economy by some distance, and is hugely influential. And particularly as Germany seeks to pivot away from Russia and find sources of energy from elsewhere, that is going to have a very notable effect on the global market. And that's something that obviously we've been seeing reflected a fair amount already in the sort of soaring energy prices we've been seeing, is that market expectation and reflection of Germany's need for more diverse energy sources.
Thank you very much, Louis, for that. Dom, can I turn to you? Kyiv has said it's waiting for the green light to receive EU candidacy status as European leaders meet in Brussels today. Can you tell us about this? What might that mean for Ukraine and for the future of Europe?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating one and worthy of a much deeper dive, possibly when Francis is back, because he'll have some really good insights into this. But basically, EU leaders are meeting today to discuss candidacy status for Ukraine and also Moldova. The EU chief Charles Michel says he expects they're going to take the decision today. President Zelensky has said it would be historic, which I mean it will because it hasn't happened before. But I mean it's historic because it will mean so much. Now, candidacy status, there's a long way to go. Or there is some way to go between that and actually being in the EU. And it could take years. Albania made the point this morning. The Foreign Ministry of Albania said it could take years, which it can do. So they're not there yet. But let's suggest that Moldova and Ukraine are given membership of the European Union. I think it then becomes a really interesting question. I'll just posit this idea: if this war that we're all looking at now grinds down into a new line of control, a lot where the forces are now. Let's say that Russia takes Luhansk Oblast and then sort of freezes, because I really don't think it can go any further through the Donetsk Oblast. So it's not going to be able to take the whole Donbas. But let's say it sort of freezes where it is. I don't think anyone would believe any lines from Moscow and from Putin to say, well, that's it, job done. Denazified, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I think we'd then realise that he's taking an operational pause, the same as there was between 2014 and February the 24th this year, and we'll come back for more later. So if in that meantime, Ukraine and Moldova, but Ukraine especially, are given or achieve EU status, would Putin attack? Is being a member of the EU enough to just put pause for thought in his mind? The EU has defence aspirations. There is the Euro Corps that sort of mainly French, German, sort of wobbles around, does a few exercises and what have you. But it does seek a greater role in defence terms. There is no collective defence treaty in anything to do with the EU at the moment. But I just wonder if in years to come, Ukraine's in the EU makes bigger, louder noises about defence. I wonder, firstly, if that's enough to make Putin pause for thought before trying something in the next few years, if this is what it comes to try and take the whole of Ukraine, or conversely, what does the EU have to do to make that pause for thought, or to give rise to that pause for thought in Putin's mind, and do they have to go as far as to have a kind of NATO Article 5 type collective defence treaty, an actual treaty obligation, or can they make all sorts of warm noises about friends always coming to each other's aid, etc., etc.? I don't know, but it'd be very interesting to see if, as we see from Russia and China to a great degree, actually, that they are pushing back against this post-war international settlement and the way that the world works, and the organisations and the institutions and the structures and the international rules-based order. If they're pushing back against that, and they're trying to remold it in their own image, or in an image that suits them. If something like being a member of the EU or any other similarly large body conferred a sort of defence arrangement as well, that would also be a development from the post-war settlement. So I think it's a really interesting time about are there going to be any stumbling blocks for EU and Moldova to become not just candidates but become members of the EU, and thereafter, what does that mean in defence terms? And I think this is one that we'll be unpicking for many, many days.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that update. Louis, can I come back to you quickly? You mentioned that you had some updates on the grain crisis. So just to remind our listeners, this is the fact that the Russian blockade in the Black Sea means that Ukraine's grain cannot be exported, which threatens large parts of Africa and other countries with extreme hunger. Louis, what's the latest there?
So we saw yesterday that infrastructure that was owned by two of the biggest agricultural traders in Ukraine was severely damaged by Russian rocket attacks. This was in the Ukrainian port city of Mykolaiv. A lot of damage has been done. This compounds these pressures that we've been seeing. It's been very difficult for Ukraine at all different parts of the grain process, basically. It's been impossible for some farmers to actually work their land. It's been very difficult to store the grain that they produce because silos and infrastructure have been damaged. And then it's been proving very difficult to actually then sell that onto the global markets because of the blockade in the Black Sea. And as we've discussed before, there have been talks and there are efforts by Ukraine to find different ways out of the country as alternatives to the Black Sea. So road transport, freight have been two particularly notable ones. Also, the possibility of some kind of naval passage through the Baltic Sea has been another option that's been discussed. But for now, there's still severe disruption. So the UN estimates that there's about 25 million tons of Ukrainian grain that just can't move at the moment, which is hugely significant because, as you said, this cascades onto global markets and creates world hunger. There's a lot of doubt at the moment as to whether talks that are occurring over ending the blockade in the Black Sea will get anywhere. It's clearly something where there's a vested interest for the Kremlin to look as though they are being humanitarian on this front, but not much has occurred so far. They've been talking for several weeks now about trying to find a way through for these grain exports, and the fact that as recently as yesterday we're seeing rocket attacks sort of tells you everything you need to know about how much actual progress is occurring there. Interestingly, though, as sort of corollary to that is grain prices and a lot of other commodity prices on global markets are now starting to ease a little bit. So if you recall, in the direct aftermath of the invasion, we saw food prices spike to all-time highs. We're now seeing a bit of easing. We're not hitting a level yet where we're thinking, it's huge relief and the pressure's gone. But supply in some areas is starting to come back online. Feels like completely the wrong word when you're describing something as sort of practical as crops. But there are signs that harvest in Western Europe might be a little bit better than expected. Russia's harvest is still looking to be quite good. Conditions are improving a bit in the United States. These are all very positive signs because you never really know what's going to happen with a crop harvest until quite late on. And even as recently as sort of a month ago, there were worrying signs that wheat harvests around the world were going to be quite bad. Signs are improving currently. So there is some hope there that some of the sort of cascading pressures that the sort of deadlock over the Black Sea has caused could ease. We'll have to see how those develop.
Well, thank you very much, Louis. Dom, can I just turn back to you? You mentioned before we went on air that you had some updates on Germany's support for Ukraine. Would you like to take us through them?
Yeah, well, I mentioned it at the start, and it's the provision of the heavy weaponry that has been cause for much gnashing of teeth in recent months. But the Panzerhaubitze 2000, the big, heavy, self-propelled 155mm artillery, are on the way, if not some already in Ukraine. And I also mentioned the Gepard anti-air defense systems. These things are tracked as well, so you can go most places. And they are used for point defense. So they're twin 35mm cannons that chuck out an enormous amount of ordnance, and they're so very good at taking down helicopters and drones. And actually, they would ruin a fast jet's day if the pilot was on a predictable straight attack run towards a target, I would suggest. And they just put a huge amount of heavy metal in the air. There was some question originally about whether or not Germany would be able to supply the ammunition for that. Sorry, Switzerland would be able to supply the ammunition for that. However, I think that's largely been discounted now with this. It's not the most common nature of ammunition, 35mm, but there are enough places that produce it such that it's not anticipated that there'd be an immediate shortage of that. I think it's going with about 600,000 rounds, but if you have a look at any of this stuff online, then you'll see that it goes through pretty quickly. So, I mean, these are good news stories from Germany. I mean, we've bashed Germany. I've bashed Germany, and we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of humanitarian aid, medical support, financial support, and also so the defence watcher Nicholas Drummond makes the point that actually, if you look at, I mean, we're 4 months into this, and the change of direction from German politics has been incredible. Now, we all got, and rightly so, hot under the collar about Germany being slightly cool on supplying heavy weaponry, but considering that where it came from, Scholz is new in power, new chancellor, and he's had to take his party and his people with him. So it is quite remarkable. We're not there yet, until we see these things in country in action and having an effect. We should reserve judgment, but I think this is a day, for all the days that we've bashed Germany. I think this is a day to say, yeah, okay. I think they've actually put chalk on the other side of the ledger here. So coalitions can fracture very easily. Germany has been seen as possibly a bit of a weak link there, but it's just worth putting it into the wider context of how far they actually have come in 4 months, and if the P2000s and the Gepards are actually in country now or just on their way, then that is to be noted and welcomed.
Well, thank you very, very much, Tom. I realise we're sort of jumping around topics slightly today, but Louis, can I come back to you? I know you have to run off soon back to the desk, but we realise that the promise of an upcoming Russian default is now very close. Can you talk us through that? What does that mean, and how have we got here?
Hi, David, and yes, apologies. Sorry, print news never really sleeps, so I will have to return to my desk quite soon. I've been teasing your readers for months with the possibility of a Russian default. We obviously came very close in April, and then it was averted at the last moment by Russia. At the risk of being the boy who cried default, this time it does seem to be for real. So last month, Russia missed making payments missed about 100 million of bond coupon payments. That triggered a 30-day grace period. We are now hitting the end of that 30-day grace period. So to the absolute best of our knowledge, the payments were not made. Sunday is the deadline. So if Russia is not able to make good on those payments, or if it doesn't emerge that they did in some way make those payments before Sunday evening, that is the moment at which, almost certainly, I would say, maybe let's say 95% sure, because funny things can happen, that is the moment of a Russian default. Now, as we've kind of discussed before, there's sort of some weirdness around how this has all gone down. So initially, there were questions over whether Russia would sort of honour these debts at all. Moscow has made it very clear that they do wish to honour these debts, and they do wish to pay foreign lenders back. What's made it very difficult is that the US has basically introduced sanctions effectively in the form of removing the exemption, and in doing so made it so actually US banks are not allowed to receive those payments. They're not allowed to act as kind of middlemen, and US investors aren't allowed to receive the money that Russia should be paying them for the bonds that they hold. That has effectively meant that for the last 5 weeks or so, a default has been sort of a de facto thing. It's been the assumption that we will hit this point at which a default is a technical inevitability, and it would seem as though Sunday night is that deadline. So Russia's teetering. They're not going down without a bit of a sort of strop. I mean, Anton Siluanov, the finance minister, was talking earlier today and said the situation looks like a farce. He says Russia will once again attempt to make payments in rubles. We've already seen that ruble payment would be considered to be a default because it's not compliant with the terms of these particular bonds. But yeah, he's not very happy. He said, you can. We're doing the best we can to repay these debts. He said you can lead a. I'm paraphrasing him slightly here, but he's saying you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We are willing and able to make these payments, and it's only the US's action that is preventing us doing that. So it is a political point. The US, if it wanted to, could create an exemption and allow these payments to occur and allow Russia to avoid a default. They took the political decision, and it is a political decision because Russia is willing and able to make these payments. So the US made this political decision to do this, and as a result, probably, as I said, let's put it at 95% or so, Russia will enter its first international default in a century, as of the beginning of next week, let's say.
And if that happens, what will happen? What should our listeners be looking to? What will be the sort of the news that you'll hear? Okay, so Russia has defaulted. What then?
Well, this is an interesting point because I think default gives you sort of impressions of everything stops, all the action ends, the music stops playing, and everybody tries to figure out what's going on. It's likely to be a bit more fragmented and sort of delayed than that. One of the most significant things, actually, from a kind of the news and when is it occurring kind of perspective, is someone will actually have to sort of put their fingers on the pulse of the Russian debt market and say, the patient died at X time, which is to say someone needs to actually determine that they've defaulted. This will probably end up being in sort of Wall Street's area. There's a panel that determines when bodies are considered to have defaulted on their debts. I presume what will happen is they will hold an emergency meeting and they will then determine whether this constitutes a default. Ordinarily in these situations, the default would be called by one of the ratings agencies, so such as Moody's, S&P's. They will not do that in this instance because they've already suspended all rating actions for Russia as a result of EU sanctions. So ordinarily they would be the kind of, as I said to you earlier, they'd be the sort of doctor by the bedside saying when it's all over. In this instance, they're not, and so it might be a bit more of a sort of delayed process before anyone actually officially calls this. Getting that technicality out of the way, the impacts of default are unlikely to be felt immediately by Russian markets. To an extent, this is already priced in. As I said, it's sort of expected. It also won't have a particularly immediate effect because Russia at the moment isn't having to tap up foreign markets very much for its debt. Where it will have an impact is if you see a bit further down the line a push from Russian corporations in particular to try and raise money on international markets, or down the line for Russia itself to try and raise money in international markets in order to, say, fund the sort of economic rebuild it's going to need after this conflict. At that point, you will find that a lot of Western investors will not be willing to touch Russian corporate or sovereign debt. And it'll be a kind of fully sort of hands-off type situation. There will then probably be a slow process of rehabilitation of Russia to global debt markets, but it will mean for a sort of a few year term, Russia will be fairly frozen out of these markets. It will have fewer places it can tap for capital, and as a result, things will become more expensive for Russia. They will have fewer opportunities to sort of fund economic growth, and you have that kind of sort of slow tire puncture type effect on its economy.
If I could jump in there, please, and Louis, may I ask a question? China, what happens here? Russia defaults. What's the relationship then with China? Do they view it? Is it good, bad, indifferent? Does it push Russia likely closer to China in economic terms? What happens to the ledger vis-a-vis Russia and China and the rest of the world, please?
Well, it's a very good and big and difficult question. We've seen, there's a very interesting dynamic. Clearly, relations between Xi and Putin are at times very close, but China has been careful throughout this conflict to maintain a certain level of distance between it and Russia, economically speaking. There are all kinds of sort of areas of clashes. I mean, we Russia and China have their own geopolitical tensions, particularly over Russia's sort of southeastern regions. A lot of these things are sort of very complicated. Now, on the sort of broad economic point that you're talking about, a couple of things to look at, I suppose. One of the big ones is there's often an assumption that Chinese businesses in particular, and obviously China does a lot as a state, but it also has very powerful state-backed businesses that operate sort of autonomously. They are often assumed to be willing to be, I suppose what we would say, I suppose you might frame it as kind of immoral actors. We might say they are very willing to sort of get their hands dirty, to get in the mix with Russian businesses, even at a time when a lot of Western businesses are trying to disengage. That's not entirely true. the United States is the world's biggest economy, and very few things matter more for an international business than being able to access the Western financial system, whether that is as a sort of participant, or it's to sort of tap it for money, or it's just to sort of operate within the sort of the trade networks that are sort of interlinked and based upon Western finance. Chinese businesses do not want to lose access to that system, and we've seen hesitancy at several points during this conflict from Russian lenders to lend money to Russia, to take this as an opportunity to make a land grab into Russia, because of that. Now, that isn't to say we haven't seen China take advantage of this. It's, as I sort of said at the beginning, it's a difficult relationship, and it's a relationship of complicated balances. China clearly economically is the far stronger of the two, and we have seen China trying to take advantage economically of the situation. We have evidence now, as a result of Chinese import figures, that China has been a really big buyer of Russian oil, which is discounted. For a while, it was unclear how much they were taking advantage of the fact that Russian oil was selling much cheaper than the global benchmark. Now we know they imported a lot of it during May. We've also seen several instances of Chinese businesses taking bigger stakes in Russian businesses, trying to get into that vacuum which the West has left by sort of pulling out en masse in response to the invasion. In conclusion, I suppose it's very complicated, and it's a, they say, keep your friends close, your enemies close. I wouldn't quite say that Putin and Xi are enemies. They have a lot of mutual interests. They are in some ways, mutually unified bloc against the West, as I suppose best represented by the US and what the US wants in the world. But that isn't to say that China isn't willing to sort of take some advantage of when Russia's having a difficult time. I'd say the other thing, just as a sort of addendum to that, is there was a lot of discussion at the onset of this conflict about the idea that this could sort of catalyze a division of the global economy between sort of broadly Western bloc and a broadly sort of Russia, China-centered bloc. I don't think we have any more clear evidence that that's happening. In fact, one thing we're just seeing more and more in recent weeks, especially as a narrative around sort of central banks trying to get inflation under control becomes more and more prominent, is that the dollar remains just incredibly powerful. It's only reinforced how vital the dollar is to the global financial system. And I don't think yet, it may be something that takes longer to become clear, I don't think yet that we're clearly seeing that sort of alternative financial system emerge. But there's no doubt that this will be accelerating that schism if it is appearing at all.
Thanks. And if I may, just 1.5 final questions. I had one question, then something you just said there about the reserve currency. I mean, what if Russia? So my question is, what strings are left? So Russia, they had the SWIFT string snapped. They've now had the default string snapped. What strings are left holding Russia in the international community of trusted economic actors, I guess, whatever the easiest shorthand is, and if Russia chooses to move away from the international order as it stands at the moment and try and get closer to Russia, try and move away from the dollar being the reserve currency, what signs should we look out for to see if they were trying to do that, trying to push the renminbi as the world's reserve currency? Or are we just so far away from that? That's a fanciful idea.
On your first question, I think the most significant part of this remains energy, and it's been the big theme of this conflict for the sort of wider world, is how essential Russia is for the global commodity markets. There's no real severe sanctioning. There's no real cutting off of Russia from the West, and there's no real disconnect occurring until you end that reliance on Russian energy. It remains so essential, and as we were discussing earlier in the podcast, this is a very hot and active topic for Germany right now. At the moment, we have this commitment from the EU to sort of by the end of the year make illegal seaborne transport of Russian oil into the bloc. If this all happens, and Europe finds a way to genuinely transition away from, wean itself off Russian oil, that will be a very significant sanction, because we're expecting that to coincide with a dip in global demand as a result of probably a general severe global slowdown. That will damage Russia. That will be the point at which Russia's so this what's been referred to as Vladimir Putin's kind of cash machine, the fact that he has these huge companies constantly drawing in huge export revenues, that's the point at which finally you'll actually see an impact there, because you can fiddle around the edges a lot. You can cut Russia off from certain schemes. You can freeze it out from a lot of ways of interacting and dealing with the Western system. But as long as money is pumping back towards Russia just as fast as oil is coming the other way, you're never really having a full financial disconnect. You're never really laying on sanctions as hard as you can. And this is the huge political question that we face, and that is the kind of the crucial point. I actually was discussing with David briefly earlier that I think one of the most interesting things actually right now is we have all these commitments about transitioning away from Russian oil, about trying to end reliance. I would be very, very interested to see what happens when we hit a point, say, if in a few months from now we see the conflict end or de-escalate, or in some way there's a thaw or someone steps back. What happens then to countries' commitments about oil? Is that the point where Germany, at that point, huge inflation, huge business upset, it'll be staring down a recession. Scholz, no doubt, will be thinking about his own political position. Is that the point at which he might become a bit more lenient, and he might say, actually, say Russia has made this concession, we therefore will accept a bit more oil? It's a real sort of question. I think there's countries are walking towards the brink on this topic, and it's hard not to think that they would be easy. It would be easy to encourage them to step back if they were given that opportunity. So I think that's something that economically is going to be very important to watch over the coming months. On the point about fragmentation of the global financial system, people often talk about this decline in use of the dollar. The actual bit that's very rarely spoken about with that is the decline in use of the dollar doesn't coincide so much with an explosion of the renminbi or other currencies. It's actually the growth of the euro is a huge part there. And actually, when you're talking about dealings between Chinese businesses and Russian businesses, it's fascinating how often actually those are euro-derived relationships. I think it's going to be one of those things where people are going to just keep watching, looking at those sort of market share feels like a reductive word, but just looking at the share of the dollar in global transactions and just seeing if that does begin to tilt in the coming years. It's going to be a glacially slow process because the dollar is so embedded. But if this fragmentation is occurring, it will show up in transactional data. You'll see the euro and the dollar will become a smaller part of sort of all global financial action. And perhaps then, you see China's currency sort of gaining some influence there. But I don't expect a sort of short, sharp kind of break.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Louis, for your time. We've kept you far too long, I realise. So thank you again. And if you've got questions about economics or and gas and all of that, please do DM. And when we have Louis on again, we'll put your questions to him. So thank you, Louis. This brings us up to 2022 London summertime. Dom, I just have one question from you from a listener. This is cycling back now to weapons, I'm afraid. This is from Lawrence, and he's got a question on heavy weapons and heavy weapons delivery to Ukraine. His essential question is, what kind of support and logistics need to be set up to support these systems? Do you need extra vehicles? What other things do you need to get them to work? And how much does all this extra material around the heavy weapon systems actually make a difference?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a great question. It's one that we just skirt over so often to our peril. But yeah, the logistic tail of all this is critical, and we've seen that played out in front of us. You see what happens if you've got some very nice shiny tanks that you push up front, and and a poor logistics support system behind it. I mean, logistics are absolutely critical for all the jibes I throw that way at blanket stackers and what have you. And it's because I've got very good friends in the logistics. None of them bloody listen to this though, do they? But anyway, never mind. Yes, so I put a lot of jibes at the loggies, but they are absolutely critical. And it's a very long tail. You need either a lot of rail, which is what Russia prefers. It's a lot easier to carry heavy freight with rail, or you need low loaders to carry vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces, and so on, so they don't wear out, or the tracks and all the rest of it. They're not great for going long distances on paved surfaces. So it's a lot easier to stick them on a low loader or on rail and move them that way. And then the ammunition itself. I mean, that takes a huge amount of organisation and movement, and of course it's very, very heavy. So you need all the infrastructure just to physically lift it on and off the vehicles, and that's just the stuff. And I'm not going to go over. I haven't got time today to talk about all the different components that go up to make a capability. But remember, having the stuff and having the ammunition is only one or two small parts of it. You need the training. Now we've seen a lot of training being done in Poland and Germany on these systems and others. And training is talked of quite widely. You mentioned yesterday how Boris Johnson says that Britain's going to be training 10,000 Ukrainian infanteers every 120 days. That's a plan yet to kick off, but hopefully soon. So training is absolutely vital. And the mechanics, the electrical mechanical engineer side of your military to keep this stuff going. So the logistics of it is critical. We've seen Russia try to find and stop these supplies coming in from the West. They're using what's left of their precision-guided munition arsenals to try and destroy the warehouses, try and destroy the railheads through which these things are transiting. I think we're going to see an uptick of that in the next few days, now that Ukraine has said that HIMARS are in the country, and that Gepards and the Panzer Howitzer 2000 are on the way. I think we'll see an uptick in Russian air-launched rocket and missile strikes in the west of the country, because these resupply lines are so powerful, so critical, and there's very little you can do with a high-end artillery piece or tank if it's running out of not just the ammunition but all the petrol or lubricants and everything else to keep it going. And that's before you even get to the crew and make sure that they know what they're doing, that they are fed and watered and rested and all that kind of stuff. So logistics is what we've seen play out here. The old military phrase of amateurs talk tactics and professional talk logistics. I mean, this war is made for that phrase, and I think we're only going to see that play out to an even greater degree now that these heavy weapons, fewer in number, but the debate between numbers and accuracy is a live one, and one worthy of examination. So now that these heavy weapons are flowing into Ukraine, we're really going to see this play out and see how these logistic chains are vital and will be sought and attacked by Russia and necessarily defended in some strength. And I mean by putting air defense assets to the west of the country, which might denude it from the front line for Ukraine, because you've got to look after this stuff when it comes into the country, where you look after it in the big sort of warehousing hubs and the rail hubs. You've got to look after it, because if it doesn't get to the front line, it's obviously useless. So no, logistics absolutely critical, and we're going to see that played out very much so in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that answer, and thank you for sending in the question, Lawrence. I believe that's we've got to the end of our time here today. So, Tom, can I just ask you very quickly for your final thoughts? What should our listeners be looking for over the next day, over maybe even looking to the weekend and the week beyond?
Well, I mean, it is allied to the answer I just gave there. I think we're going to see a lot of strikes in the west of the country. Lviv has not been hit. That's right over in the west by the Slovakian border. Not been hit for some time now. I think we're going to see an uptick there. I think we're going to see possibly some more action, as we saw a couple of days ago, Ukraine rooting out Russian spies, in their words, to find these people who are going around looking for these logistic hubs. So I think there's going to be more action in there. So I would expect to see more arrests and more news there from the Ukrainian government about these sort of fifth columnists, if you like, who are looking for these resupply lines, and more strikes across the rest of the country. Not forgetting, of course, that I think the they're by no means finished in the Donbas. That could well intensify in the next few days. Now that there seems to be a mini breakthrough. Today's British Defence Intelligence Assessment says that they've advanced about 5 k's in 4 days. So pretty much what we've been saying, about a kilometre a day. But there's not a lot of kilometres left in that Severodonetsk pocket. So I think we are approaching some sort of end game there. I hate using the phrase game. Of course, it's not a game, but a resolution to that fight. Ukraine seems to be pulling out its people where it can efficiently do so, and without allowing the front to collapse. So a lot of fighting in the east, but I think we're going to see an increase in fighting across the whole of the country over the next few weeks. And as we really step up, as the war grinds to an attritional line in that east, I think there's going to be a lot more violence across a lot more of the country in the next few weeks.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.